Getting hit in the face is one thing. Getting hit in the face by a heavyweight champion is another thing entirely.
I thought one way I could write would be to put myself in unusual, bizarre situations.
Yeah.
And that was to read the encyclopedia like my dad did.
How long did it take to read the entire encyclopedia?
It took, well, I don't know how I did it because I was working at the time 5 hours a day. Then I would go home and read the encyclopedia for 6 hours, taking notes and coming up with essays. Having grown up without religion, what was I missing? So I thought, what if I became the ultimate fundamentalist and followed everything? So that meant everything in the Old and the New Testament.
A full year.
Oh, yeah. And I came away with lots of takeaways.
What was the most difficult thing to follow for an entire year?
Well, there were two types of difficulty. There was the...
Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Travis Makes Friends podcast, where it is our mission to help you build better relationships, whether that's making more friends in a new city or furthering the ones that you already have and kind of deepening those existing connections. Today on the show, we're going to be talking about a year of living constitutionally with my new friend, AJ Jacobs. AJ, what's up? Welcome to the show.
Thank you, my friend.
Well, I have to say, you are committed to the craft.
Thank you. Well, I commit to the bit. I don't know if it's a craft, but I definitely commit to the bit.
Yeah, so you do these kind of crazy life experiments where you take an entire year of your life. The most recent one was the year of living constitutionally. And you basically live to the letter of the law of the Constitution. And then the one you did a few years back is the year of living biblically.
Right.
And I am very curious about how both of these experiments went. But before we dive into those things, I want to jump back in time through a little portal and figure out how you got here to doing these types of crazy challenges. Multiple New York Times bestselling author, journalist, things like that. Let's turn the clock back to 12, 13-year-old AJ, though. Talk to me about what life was like back then for you.
Well, in some ways, not great, because I wasn't a very socially adept person.
Okay.
Sometimes I'm not. I would say I'm still not necessarily. But I did have curiosity, and that is one of my favorite emotions or drives, curiosity. One of my, I just wrote a little Substack on the phrase, get curious, not furious. And I think that is one of the guiding principles of my life, because it's so easy to get angry, and I feel that is not productive, plus not pleasant. So when you're presented with a problem, get curious. See the world as a puzzle. So that was it. I always was curious, and I always loved words and books. I won't say I always loved writing.
Okay.
Because I still don't. I think it's a horrible activity.
That seems to be the consensus. I've talked to a lot of authors on the show, and it's so funny because they're like, I feel called to do it, but the work itself sucks, or at least many aspects of the work.
Right. Well, that's the thing. The actual sitting alone in a room in front of a screen, that I do think sucks. But there are many aspects of it that don't suck. And to me, one of those is research, interviewing people, going out there and experiencing stuff, thinking, being exposed to new ideas, the curiosity again, talking about it. I love talking about it. Like now is much more pleasant than trying to sit and form a sentence. So anyway, I always wanted to write. They often say, write what you know, write about your own life. My life was not that interesting. I had, I grew up in New York City, and I had parents who were nice to me, and they weren't circus performers or spies or astronauts.
Didn't have a crazy origin story.
I didn't have a crazy
What did your parents do?
My father's a lawyer, and my mother was a teacher, a science teacher.
Okay.
So I thought one way I could write would be to put myself in unusual, bizarre situations and see what I learned. One of my writing heroes was this guy named George Plimpton, and he was in the 60s and 70s. He focused mainly on sports. He was like a regular guy, not that strong, not great at sports, but he would convince an NFL team to let him be a place kicker for a game.
Oh, interesting.
And then write about it. I guess if they were like, 0-14.
It didn't really matter.
It's like, all right, fine. And he did that with baseball and boxing. He got hit in the face by of a heavyweight champion.
Oh, geez.
So I thought that was interesting as an approach.
Yeah.
I don't like getting hit in the face personally, but I put myself in more socially awkward situations.
Yeah, getting hit in the face is one thing. Getting hit in the face by a heavyweight champion is another thing entirely.
That is true.
Yeah.
Well, that's hence the essay that he was able to create several pages on that.
So in growing up, having an attorney for a father and a teacher for a mother, I assume education was very much high value inside of your family.
And I am very grateful for that. In fact, my first book was inspired by my dad's love of learning and word nerdery. When I was a kid...
Word nerdery, I like that.
Word
That's a good
nerdery.
phrase.
When I was a kid, he started to read the Encyclopedia Britannica, which some of your younger listeners may not even know what that is, but it's the Wikipedia with pages.
It's the old door-to-door sales guide.
Exactly. Yeah. But he did not finish. He made it up to the middle of the letter B, so it didn't get that far because he had a life, he had kids and stuff. But I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to try to finish what he began and cruise on through to Z? So that was the origin of my first book.
That was the original experiment.
Yes, it was called The Know-It-All.
Yeah.
And I read the encyclopedia, and then I arranged the book with chapter A, chapter B. So writing about what I learned, the weird things I learned, but also about how it affected my life. And I mean, sometimes in good ways, sometimes my wife would penalize me $1 for every irrelevant fact I inserted into conversation. So it was, it was a mix. I went on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and I joined Mensa and all this stuff.
From that one experiment.
Yeah, because I feel as a writer, it's almost cinematic. I need set pieces, is what they call them in movies, where it's not. I don't think it would be that great a book if I just sat in my room and read. That's a hard book to write. But if I go out and I, go on a game show, or I go to Mensa, or I go to the headquarters of the encyclopedia, then that's a fun adventure.
How far did you make it on Millionaire?
I made it to $32,000, and then they got me with one that I still kick myself. It was the meaning of the word erythrocyte, which is it's a red blood cell. So, and I guessed something else, white blood cell maybe.
So were you beyond the $32,000 mark, and then because that's the one where they lock you in at $32,000?
Yeah,
right?
no, I know. I lost $31,000 because
gotcha.
I had a biology major as my lifeline. So he owes me $31,000.
Yeah, no kidding. They didn't get that one right. A biology major.
I know. Very
That's
frustrating.
The worst. Was it with Regis?
No, it was the Meredith Vieira one that aired during the day.
Okay, got it. Well, that's probably a pretty cool experience. Now, talk to me about Mensa. How does one get into Mensa?
Well, Mensa's a funny experience. Yeah, I got in kind of in a loophole. I was smart. I wasn't smart enough to pass. They have a very rigorous IQ test where you have to find patterns, you have to do logic problems.
But that's essentially mostly IQ tests. They're mostly find these patterns, look for the pattern in this thing, and move to the next thing, right? Like I think people have this conception that IQ tests, if they haven't taken one, is like like an SAT, and it's like no, it's actually very different. Like, you can't study for an IQ test. It just measures.
That's the goal. Although you can kind of hack it, and I didn't make it in on that, but I found on the website in like small print. A loophole what said at that time, I don't know if it's still true, you could submit your SAT scores. And if your SAT scores were high enough, then you were considered Mensa material.
Oh, interesting.
And I did pretty well. Not that well. Well, 1,600. But I did it well enough that I snuck in.
Oh, nice.
To Mensa, which was hilarious.
So it didn't really have much to do with the experiment or reading through the encyclopedia as much as it was like you have to meet these rigorous, strict testing requirements.
Exactly. Because there's they say there's a difference between knowledge and trivia and then your ability to think and reason. And so they define intelligence more as that, as opposed to, I know the capital of the river in Hungary.
Yeah. What was your experience being in there?
Well, I went to a Mensa convention in Staten Island.
Okay.
And it was interesting. And actually, it was sort of very prescient of the COVID days because everyone wore a sticker. You either had a red, green, or yellow sticker. And Green said, yes, I'm okay hugging.
Yeah.
Yellow said, ask before hugging. And red said, no hugging. No hugging at all. So it was interesting. Is I think that in terms of social norms, that's unusual.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it kind of makes sense.
Sure. Yeah.
So,
Just describe the average person at a Mensa convention.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I didn't, and this was just one, so I'm not saying this is all, but my experience was you didn't get like high power executives and entrepreneurs, and it was more people who hadn't excelled in the traditional careers that society values, but I guess maybe they were frustrated and they wanted to show, hey, I'm smart, even though I may not be making millions of dollars and be a CEO. So this is my way of doing that. And a lot of games, which I love. We played a lot of games.
Okay.
We did a lot of, So
I think that is an interesting observation, because a misconception that people have, I think, is that intelligence is required to be successful, especially in, financially successful, when that I've never found that to be the case. And especially because it seems like sometimes the higher the IQ, the lower the EQ.
Right.
And
EQ is
people,
so crucial.
Yeah. People are part of money,
Right.
like you have to, in order to be successful in any of these fields in particular, there's fewer fields, I guess is what I'm trying to say. There's fewer fields that you can rise to the top to without having to be good at dealing with people.
Totally agree. Yeah, EQ is everything, and to some extent, it can be taught. I think there's sort of a idea you're either born with these skills or you're not.
Yeah.
But I think I've trained myself to be a little bit more higher EQ. I think I have bumped up my EQ.
You have more direct control over your EQ than you do your IQ.
I think that's true. I think that's true.
I would have to agree with that.
Yeah.
You can learn. You can get better at dealing with people.
Right. And also, it's a lot about seeing the world from their point of view. That is a very good mental exercise that I try to do every day. And I do that, I think, as an entrepreneur, you want to do that. What would your customers want?
You have to.
How is their experience? And as a writer, I feel that way. I mean, one of the things I think I am pretty good at, I'm not good at every aspect of writing, but one is being able to have this sort of fresh mind and go inside the mind of the reader and almost erase all of my previous knowledge and read the book as if I were just hearing about it. And that is a super helpful skill. So
extremely valuable, for sure.
Yeah.
I like to look at it like liken it to a pair of glasses. Like, everybody's got a pair of glasses that they have on all the time. Like, it's impossible to see the world as it is.
Right.
You can only see it through the glasses that you have on, which is context, perspective, religious background, education, culture, society, parents, teachers. Like, everybody's got their own pair of glasses on, and you got to do your best to be able to somehow remove your glasses to some extent and then take somebody else's pair and put them on for a second and see what the world looks like through those different lenses,
And I have a list of sort of maxims that I read every morning. And one of them is, when I read the news, I try to adopt the veil of ignorance. You ever hear of that phrase?
Veil of ignorance. No, please expound.
It's from a philosopher named John Rawls.
Okay.
And he said that the best way to think about when you're setting up a society is, how would you set it up if you didn't know what you were? You don't know whether you're male, female, you're rich, you're poor, you're black, you're white. You are from a veil of ignorance. What is the fairest way to set up a society? And I love that concept.
Yeah.
Because it's hard. It's hard, as you say, to take off your own glasses. This is an attempt to have no glasses, which is impossible.
Right.
But it's an interesting
exercise.
Yeah,
very helpful, for sure.
Right.
Okay, so you grew up, education's very valuable. What did you end up going to school for?
I actually majored in philosophy at Brown University, which was maybe not the most not the most practical in some ways, but in other ways, it really tied into this idea of curiosity. And I also found it helpful because I really spent 4 years wrestling with ideas, and, is there a God? And I came away saying, it's impossible to answer. It is not. So I was like, all right, good.
Did you have, sorry to cut you off, did you have, did your parents have an answer to that question? Like, were you raised with a certain belief?
We were raised very secular, which was sort of the inspiration for my book on the Bible, as I didn't know. But yeah, so I felt there are limits to human knowledge, and it's sort of a relief. Like, I am never going to know for sure whether we have free will or whether there's a God.
The free will one is interesting.
That's a tough one. Yeah. But there are things that I can experience. How can we make the best society? That is something I can still dig into.
Yeah, I was just reading this article, right before my trip here, that said there's some new AI program that is able to predict what decision a person's going to make in a particular setting 5 to 10 seconds before they make the decision, and it's up to like a 90% accuracy.
Wow.
And it really furthers, that idea of determinism is like, put up by people like Robert Sapolsky in his book Determined and things. And it's just like, I just, there's something about it. Like my litmus test, or the filters that I run through on like a belief system on whether or not I would like to participate in that belief system, is typically like, does it help? Does it harm other people? And is it useful for me to believe? And determinism is one of those things that I don't feel like it's super useful, because it seems like it takes autonomy away from an individual, which it seems like a path that can only lead to nihilism, and I don't understand how it doesn't.
Well, let me give you a little counter.
Please do.
Because I think you're right. It has that danger of nihilism, and you're like, well, why should I do anything except sit on the couch and eat Fritos because it's all determined? On the other hand, I lean towards determinism, but I'm still very much out there doing things because I know that eating Fritos. It may be determined, but it's not going to get me what I want. Second, I think determinism is very helpful and useful when dealing with others and having compassion for bad luck. Because luck, like you said, there's so many things that go into success. There's intelligence, emotional EQ, but also luck. They're some of the most brilliant, hardworking, emotionally brilliant people, but they just had a run of bad luck. And so having a more determinist view that, it was not meant to be for them.
It wasn't in the cards. Yeah.
It wasn't in the cards. And so let's have a little compassion instead of saying, you lazy idiot.
Right.
You didn't achieve what I achieved.
It definitely helps you have a higher level of empathy. And that's kind of what I wrestle with is like, you ever heard the phrase, when you're born, you look like your parents. When you die, you look like your choices.
No, that's a good one. Because the idea is like you're
born into circumstances,
right?
But then when you die, you are a product of the choices that you make,
right?
But the question that I wrestle with is, when does it switch? Because like you can't, if you continue to blame your circumstances for 70 years, that's probably not a productive use of your time.
True.
But also there is some sort of recognition. If you're So I grew up in this a very fundamentalist Baptist background. So a little culty, other people would call it a cult. I call it a cult because it's easier to just explain to people what it is, because saying I grew up going to church doesn't tell people exactly what it was. This is in Southern California of all places.
Oh, interesting.
LA County. And there's a documentary that came out on this thing, and actually my producer Eric Skorzynski's hosts a podcast called Preacher Boys, and it's kind of a deep dive into abuse that exists within the independent fundamental Baptist movement across the country. And HBO doc came out on it, and Eric is kind of the main talking head as far as like being an expert in that space.
Wow.
And there was one of the girls that was one of the victims that they were kind of highlighting in that documentary. She was talking about her parents ran this camp for troubled teens, and just some of the stuff that they did was just so terrible. But when she was a teenager, she was actively participating in, being the oppressor in that particular situation before she, really knew. And it's like, how responsible is she for her actions at that point in her life?
Right.
Because when you're born, like you said, you're born, you look like your parents or your circumstances. When you die, you look like your choices. And now she's made the choices and she's become, aware of those things. But leading up to a certain point, you're like, hey, if I were raised in that same frame with those parents telling me that these are the
Sure.
things that are not just okay to do, but like morally correct, like you are righteous in doing these things and called by God to do them, and you can definitely do these things, I would probably be doing those same things. Like it's really easy to point the finger and be like, like the Nazi soldier,
Right.
example that everybody uses. It's really easy to point the finger and be like, there's no way. But, to a certain extent, we would all be a victim of that circumstance. But the question is, at what point, like I said, at what point does it switch?
Right.
At what point, because if she's 38 and still doing those things, it's like, okay, well, you're actively choosing this now. It's not just like you were born into this circumstance. So that's kind of the question that I wrestle with a lot, is like, well, at
Right.
what point does it become you versus
It
just
is
your
a
circumstance?
fascinating question. I mean, one thing that I find useful is questioning my own biases and trying not to have motivational reasoning. So, I am
Motivational reasoning, can you define what that is?
sure. It's when you read something in the newspaper and you only see what you want to see. So if it's an article about the pros and cons of the death penalty and you're anti-death penalty, you only see, I knew death penalty was terrible.
Yeah.
So trying to overcome that, I think, is very helpful in getting beyond, because I agree. If my parents had watched Fox News, it wasn't around, but the equivalent of Fox
Sure.
News, I would probably be a conservative. And since I grew up in sort of a liberal home, I sort of lean that way, but I try to take a step back and say, let's not be a knee-jerk liberal. Let's look at the big picture and try to get away from my own biases, what really will be better for
Yeah.
the world. And I don't agree with liberals on many issues. It's not a one axis. We shouldn't say liberal and conservative. They're like
Yeah.
100 issues, and each one has its pros and cons.
Yeah, I hate the idea of being lumped into a bucket because of a letter next to your name on a voter registration card.
Right.
It's just like, well, it's so hard to just define a person as being this way,
Right.
because
And
then
it's
all of a
just-
sudden you disagree and then you get kicked out.
Yeah,
You know?
exactly. And it's only two in America.
Right.
And the founding fathers did not want that. The founders, James Madison, wanted it to be more like Europe, where they'll have a parliament with several different parties. He thought that there were going to be all these different factions and they would all fight and they would all ally and have moving alliances. But it settled into this duopoly, which is, I think, terrible for our country.
Do you think it's possible in the next few decades to move away from that?
It's a great question. I hope so. I just read an interesting New York Times article about how to do it. And a lot of it has to do with changing the way we vote so that, whether it's instead of the ranked choice voting might help. But I hope so, because this is a terrible system.
Yes.
Like nothing is black and white or just has two sides. They have multiple sides.
Yeah, the polarity is just sickening sometimes,
It's the worst.
especially during election years. It's just you can't get away from it.
No.
Yeah. Okay, so you go to school. What did you study in school?
I was a philosophy major.
That's right, philosophy. And when you were coming out of school, did you have an idea that you wanted to get into journalism? Like, what was that process of discovery like?
I did, and because one of the advantages of writing and journalism is that it's the perfect job for someone who's continually curious.
That's very true.
And
That's why I podcast.
Yeah, exactly. You get to talk to people from all over, and that's exactly what I did. So, and I've been lucky because I've written 8 books or so, and each one is about a very different topic. So I've had sort of a 2-year master's course in religion and gratitude and health and the U.S. government. That's awesome.
Yeah. What was your first job in journalism?
I was a freelancer, which was not a very good position. Then I worked for a small newspaper.
It was not a very good position.
Well, it was more, free. You were very, you're basically writing for free when you started out.
Yeah,
So
freelancer, but
meant
emphasis
free.
on the free.
Yeah, exactly. But and then I went to work for a very small newspaper, which is not a path I would recommend people now because they barely exist.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah.
But the good part was, I think, and this still does exist. You got to go out and you got to interact with people and get the details. So if you're talking to someone who there was a gunfire through their window, like, what were you doing? I was eating lunch. What did you have for lunch? Oh, I had a sandwich. What kind of sandwich? Oh, ham sandwich with cheese. Now you've got some details, and details make for good writing. And that is such an important skill that I think is much harder if you're only on the internet and rewriting and aggregating and interpreting other people's takes.
Oh, yeah, I see.
So I do, even if you are a writer who's mostly in opinion columns, go out there and meet people and ask the questions and get the details.
Belly to belly. Yeah.
What's that?
Belly to belly.
Belly to
Yeah, that's what I like to call it. Yeah, in person, like belly to belly.
Yeah, well, that's
like
your
get out
whole
there
thing.
and do it.
That's
Yeah,
your whole thing.
yeah, definitely. So journalism, you're writing these articles, small, like short form stuff. When did you decide that you wanted to write a book, like a full long form piece of writing?
Well, I did. I'd always wanted to write a book because I love diving into a topic. I first wrote a sort of, it was like a novelty humor throwaway book that they sell by the cash register. It was on the eerie similarities between Elvis Presley and Jesus. Because at one point Elvis announced that he thought he might be the second coming. And I said, well, let's investigate this. So it was just it was very short. And it was like, I can't even believe it became a book because it was literally 800 words. But someone liked it, turned it into a book. And from there, I became friends with the editor. And then I had this idea taken from my life. And a lot of the best ideas are just taken from your life, I feel. Yeah. And that was to read the encyclopedia like my dad did.
So did you decide to read it first and then like halfway through, like I should write a book about this? So it was deal.
Yeah.
I want you to read this and we will give you a
I
book
read
deal.
the letter A. When you write nonfiction, even today, you usually don't have to write the whole book. Often in fiction, you do have to write the whole book, especially starting out, and then send it to the agent. In nonfiction, you have the idea. You can write like a 20, 30-page proposal, and that proposal can include the idea, and you try to hook them in the very beginning.
Yeah.
A sample chapter, so I wrote the chapter A, and then sort of marketing and a list, a table of contents. So that's what I did. I read the letter A, and then I said, if you want the other 25, then I am ready to go.
Yeah. How long did it take to read the entire encyclopedia?
It took, well, I don't know how I did it because I was working at the time at Esquire magazine, which was a full-time job as an editor. I didn't have kids. That helped. So
certainly helps. Yeah.
Yeah. And I also, my boss was very nice not to fire me because I was like phoning in my job. I was like working 5 hours a day. Then I would go home and read the encyclopedia for 6 hours, taking notes and coming up with essays. Because it wasn't just like, here's 1,000 facts. I had to weave together ideas and essays about one of the themes was how terrible the past is. Like, we should not have nostalgia for the good old days. The good old days sucked. The good old days were, cutting-edge medicine was the tobacco smoke enema, where they would literally put a hose in your ass and blow smoke up your ass. That was considered, in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, that was like very popular for curing all sorts of things. So yeah, no, you don't want...
Is that where the phrase comes from?
It's an interesting question. I have spent way too long trying to figure that out. I would say 60% chance it is where the phrase comes from.
There's got to be a correlation there for sure.
Yeah,
that's crazy. I did not know that.
That's just one of the horrible things they did. I mean, there's trepanation where you drill a hole in your skull to let out the evil spirits. I mean, the old days were not great. We have a lot of problems now.
Yeah.
But let's not have this false nostalgia.
Yeah, it always, whenever I hear stories like that too, it always makes me wonder, what are the things right now that are going to be old days in a couple hundred years?
That's such a great
So
question.
everybody, you tend to romanticize the present and think that we figured out so many things. Like we
Right.
have figured out quite a few things, but there's probably also going to be some things that in a couple hundred years they're looking back and being like, you guys did this
I
back in
agree.
2025? That's
I mean,
wild.
I have some theories, and I'd love to hear yours. I mean, one is we have a housekeeper who comes and scrubs, the bathroom. I think in 100 years they'll be like, "You asshole! I can't believe you had someone," because they'll have Roombas to do that.
Yeah.
And like, you had a human being
Right.
go into your bathroom, and so
Yeah.
I think that will be looked down on. I mean, I do think that our treatment of animals in factory farms will be like, what were you thinking?
I think processed food in general too.
Right.
That's pretty nasty one that
Yeah.
like we're still learning the negative health, effects of these massive companies that have been, pushing terrible health choices on people through their desire for more profit.
Right.
And then treating it with more things that are also not great for you long term. I think some of
Right.
those pharmaceutical stuff, pharmaceutical advertising, I think is potentially one thing. The
That's
fact that
interesting,
us
yeah.
and New Zealand are the only countries in the world that allow pharmaceutical companies to advertise on TV. I think that's
Really?
a
I
pretty
didn't know
wild
that.
thing. Yeah.
Interesting.
We're the only two countries in the world that allow pharmaceutical companies to advertise on TV. And I mean, their pockets are so deep that the networks want to make the money.
Right.
But also it's like, should we be pushing, should I be asking my doctor about these 23 different drugs that I could potentially take? I just can't imagine, opening up the pill box and you're taking 13 different medications for different things that treat, that chemical mixture of things. There's just no way we can know the long-term negative potential benefit or potential, problems that are going to arise
Right.
from that just weird mixture of chemicals over a long period of time. I think some of those things are going to be things that they look back on and go like, oh, remember when they used to do that? That's crazy. But yeah, I think sometimes it's good to put those glasses on and realize that we're not justified in any of the decisions that we're making long term based on the context of our time. You know what I mean? It's just, we're going to figure some stuff out. And,
Right. We are not the end of the moral evolution.
Correct.
And people
Exactly.
get cocky and think, oh, well, we are. But
Yeah.
no.
Romanticizing the present. Yeah. Okay. So the encyclopedia book was the first book.
Right.
What became the second book?
The second one was one you mentioned earlier called The Year of Living Biblically.
Yeah, I'm very curious about this one because the way I grew up, my bachelor's degree is actually a double major in Bible and church ministries.
Wow.
So I'm curious.
Was it at a religious institution?
Yeah, it was at the same. So I graduated college on the same campus that I graduated kindergarten from,
Wow.
which was also where my church was in the whole high school and everything. It was all on one mega campus.
Wow.
So very much like in a bubble from 3 to 21-ish.
Fascinating.
So yeah, I'm very curious to hear what your perspective on the Bible was.
Well, mine was
coming from a secular background.
Right. I had
and
the
then-
exact opposite experience where I had very little religion in my life at all. As I say in the book, I'm Jewish, but I'm Jewish in the same way the Olive Garden is Italian, which is not very.
Perfect way to sum it up. Yeah.
Yeah. But I was very interested in religion. I had a young kid. I wanted to know what to teach him.
Okay.
So there were sort of two motivations for the book, and they were almost a little paradoxical. The first was, having grown up without religion, what was I missing? I mean, there were billions of people. Most of the world has some sort of religion, so there must be something good in it that I'm totally missing. The second motivation was that I saw people who were fundamentalist who said that we need to follow everything in the Bible. But
That was us. Yeah.
yeah, so that's interesting. But my feeling was, yeah, they were picking and choosing parts to follow. So I thought, what if I became the ultimate fundamentalist and followed everything? So that meant everything in the Old and the New Testament. That meant everything from the Bible says you cannot shave the corners of your beard. I didn't know where the corners were, so I just let the whole thing grow, and I looked like, Gandalf. And the Bible says in the Old Testament that you cannot wear clothes made of two different kinds of fabrics. So I had to get rid of all my polycotton sweaters, and the Bible says that you should stone adulterers. So I tried to do that. I used very small stones.
How did that go?
Yeah, the guy did not like it, even though I was using pebbles. It was still.
Did you ask his permission? Like, how did that even work out?
I kind of did. Well, I'll tell you very quickly. I was in Central Park, and I live in New York, and I was really getting into it. So I had my robe and my sandals and the beard, and he came up to me and said, "What's going on? Why are you dressed like that?" I said, "Well, I'm trying to follow everything in the Bible, from the Ten Commandments to stoning adulterers." He says, "I'm an adulterer. Are you going to stone me?" And I said, "That'd be great. Thank you. What a nice offer." And I took out some stones that I'd been carrying around for weeks.
For such an occasion.
For such an occasion. And as I mentioned, they were very small stones. I showed them to him. I'd say, "Here are the ones I would throw at you." He got very angry and grabbed the stones out of my hand and threw them at me. So I had
After he said that you could do it?
No, he never said I could do it.
Okay.
He just asked, "Are you going to stone me?"
Yeah.
Not like, "Will you stone me?"
Yeah.
So I thought an eye for an eye. He had thrown him at me. I could throw him at him. So I threw him at him, and he stormed off. That was my adulterer stoning. That's how I checked it off my list. So it was a wild year. It was bizarre and absurd at times.
A full year.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
I felt that. And along the same lines, I went to a lot of adventures. So I went to Jerry Falwell's church and spent time there.
Ooh.
I hung out with the Amish, the Hasidic Jews, and I came away with lots of takeaways. One is, don't follow the Bible literally, and no one does. It's okay to cherry pick.
Yeah.
If you are going to cherry pick, I say you should pick the cherries about love and compassion, loving your neighbor, instead of homosexuality as a sin.
Right.
But also there were more deeper, I wouldn't say deeper, there were more ones that affected my lifestyle, like a lot about gratitude. That was a big lesson, and compassion, and all these other.
So positives and negatives.
Exactly,
Yeah.
positives and negatives.
Yeah. What about the slaves part?
Well, it was interesting. There was I wrestled with that a lot because they did have Hebrew slaves in the Bible, and it was considered in the Old Testament perfectly acceptable.
In the New Testament as well.
Yeah,
There's
you're
instructions on what on how like slaves should behave, or how masters should treat their slaves.
Oh, right. Well, that is a good point. But yeah, so there was this kid who wrote to me and said he wanted to be my summer intern, and I said, "Well, is it okay if I call you sort of a Hebrew biblical slave?" And because I wasn't paying him, so I figured there was that. But he did. He said, like, "Great, I'm in." So that was kind of how I
circumvented the legal system.
That off. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some wild stuff in there, man. What was the most difficult thing to follow for an entire year?
Well, there were two types of difficulty. There was the difficulty where you had to avoid all of the sins, and the big and the small. I could avoid not killing someone.
Sure.
But not coveting or gossiping or lying. I live in New York City, and I work as a journalist. That's pretty much 80% of my time. So that is a challenge. And I did pick up some strategies on how to be a better person, how to do moral makeover. One of them was act as if you're a good person, even if you don't feel it. So it's that whole of acting as if, and fake it till you become it. But then there were the ones that we mentioned that were tough, like stoning adulterers, and not using the names of heathen gods. So they're everywhere, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Those, I couldn't say that. I couldn't say Venus Williams was playing it. So, there are all these rules that if you really follow them will make you act like a very bizarre person.
What was your kind of bigger takeaway overarching in philosophy and religion coming out of that year?
Well, I think what you said, it's a religion, I think, is a tool, and it can be a tool for good or a tool for bad, just like any tool, like a hammer.
Yeah.
And I think that I try to split things up more into absolutism versus flexible thinking. So you can have communism is a religion in the sense that it's people just buy into it wholeheartedly, like a cult, like you were saying. So, and even free market fundamentalism, I think, can be seen as a cult because I think life is more complicated than that. So I see it as a split between fundamentalism and flexible thinking versus all religion is good or all religion is bad.
Yeah. You got to have some sort of flexible thinking, but that is kind of the opposite of cult-like behavior, right? That at least if you follow the, Hassan's BITE model, the behavior control, information control, thought control, emotion control, most of those I won't say most, but a lot of religious philosophies, especially fundamentalism, is definitely falling within that bucket.
Yeah.
There is not flexibility.
Right.
They do not allow.
They fear it. Yeah.
Correct. They don't want external thoughts.
I'm going to write that down.
Yeah. Yeah. Stephen Hassan's
model.
kind of the cult guy, the kind of foremost expert on cults, but he has that model that helps you kind of just run the filters through. Because his argument is basically like, not all cults are bad. Like cults exist everywhere, not just within a religious context. They exist everywhere, and that doesn't being a cult by itself is not a bad thing. However, people can use it to be a really bad thing.
Interesting.
When in the wrong context. Because he would refer to it as even like working at a company where they have like a cult-like culture.
Right.
It's like, well, some things can be positive about it, but there's also a lot of really bad things that can
interesting.
That can come through.
Yeah, I guess I would say, I haven't thought about it enough, but I would say rituals can be good, and being in a community is good. So those aspects of cult-like behavior. But I think the word cult to me indicates unquestioning belief. And that I think is bad and outweighs the good of the community.
And to me, it's obviously fear-based. It's like, what are you so afraid of? Like, why are questions making you fearful?
Right.
Like if you genuinely 100% believe that you have the truth, then you would think questions would only lead you further, or would only lead you closer to what you already believe, because it's the truth.
Well,
and questions only uncover the truth.
I love that. And when I was writing about curiosity, that was authoritarian societies hate curiosity. Because that leads to changes that they may not want. And the Bible starts out hating curiosity. The whole Garden of Eden, the big sin is that Eve ate the apple so that she got knowledge.
The knowledge, yeah.
And God just wanted them to be ignorant, blissfully ignorant.
What did you take away from it in terms of raising your son?
I took away one thing was what I mentioned, the importance of ritual. I think those can be beautiful. So I do now do more Jewish rituals. So, for instance, the Seder and the Passover, which is the Last Supper, I like that ritual where you go and you tell the story. I mostly like it because you're bringing together your family. I don't believe that the story happened the way it's written in the Bible. I think it's a myth. It's a parable, but it's a lovely parable about getting out from under oppression. So that I think is a big one, and we did end up having our kids bar mitzvah. None of them are particularly religious or believing, but I think they agree with me that having these rituals to remind them of bigger issues about justice and is a good thing.
How did your partner react when you're committing to these year-long experiments?
My wife Julie is very patient, so some she likes better than others. The Bible one she did not like at all because, I mean, for instance, the Bible says in the Old Testament, you cannot touch women during their menstruation time, and because they're impure. And if you take Leviticus really literally, if a woman who's menstruating sits in a seat, then that seat becomes impure. So my wife found that offensive and sat in every seat in our apartment. So I had to stand for the year. So that was an example. And then later I wrote a book about health, and it turns out standing is healthier. So I figure she was doing a nice thing for me.
The one prompt from my Apple Watch that I bear is when it reminds me to stand.
There you go.
Oh, man, it's annoying, but also probably a good move. That I should probably stand up.
Exactly.
Especially when you have like a more sedentary type job where you're sitting down most of the time.
Right.
It's probably a good reminder.
Agree. And I do have a treadmill desk that I use.
Oh, there you go.
So
nice.
not all the time, but.
Was that kind of, I think that was the first time that I heard about you, obviously being raised the way that I was raised. What year did that book come out?
That was a long time ago because that was 18 years ago, I think.
Okay.
Because my kids were my twins. The Bible says, be fruitful and multiply.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had twins. I followed that.
Certainly multiplied, yeah.
So and they're 18 now. So.
Oh, wow. Okay. So easy way to remember then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I want to say the first time that I heard about it, saw it on some sort of news something. Did you get a good amount of just like organic media traction doing things like that?
I got a ton. I mean, a lot of it had to do with visual, and this has become clearer and clearer. We're a visual society. Mm-hmm. So I did have the foresight to take a lot of footage and photos of me looking crazy.
Looking like
with
Moses
my beard,
walking around.
Right, with the long white robes and the sand and the beard. So even just having me clean shaven to me looking like Moses got tons of, so it was, it got a lot of, and I've tried to take that with all of my books, try to think visually, what will appeal to TV shows or websites.
What's going to make this easy to market, essentially?
Yeah.
Did you get pushback from religious communities?
Much less. I was very nervous, but not really.
Okay.
I got one. I was on Kirk Cameron's radio show. Do you know him?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And he tried to convert me for an hour, but
really?
Most of people, because again, I didn't go in with an axe. I went in with deep curiosity, and I found good things, and good and bad. I tried to be very fair. So I spoke at tons of atheist conventions, but as many, if not more, churches and synagogues, and I spoke to like a group of like 1,000 Baptist preachers once.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So it was it was much better, and I think it was because I genuinely went in trying to be humble and say, I know I don't have all the answers. I'm just doing an experiment and see what works for me and what doesn't.
When you're coming up with all these ideas, like I said, obviously it's a massive commitment, not just to the writing process, but to do something that's uncomfortable for an extended period of time. Like doing something for a week or a month is much easier than doing it for an entire year.
True.
How do you decide what gets your attention? Like, are there ideas that you've had that you just like put on the table? You just, I got to shelf that. There's no way I can do that or something.
Well, just in general, I think creativity is a numbers game. So I come up with 100 ideas and hope that 2 or 3 of them are good and workable. And I have started some books that I abandoned. I think some of the criteria I use is, will it be entertaining for the reader? Will it be interesting? Will it make the world a better place? It's a little cheesy, but true. Will it have visual scenes that I can use to market it? All of these play into it. And sometimes I've done stuff that is, the New York Times asked me to write an article about living for a month without plastic. And I said, when I researched it, I was like, I can do that in a day. And I pitched it back to him. I was like, all I need is a day without plastic because it is so like everywhere. So when I wake up and I put my feet on the floor, all carpets have plastic. So I'm all ready.
Wow.
Everything, your toothbrush has plastic. Every little part of your life has plastic. So I can make the point in one day, maybe even better, than if I spent a month
Wow.
without plastic.
And did they end up doing that?
Yeah, it was on the cover of the style section, and it was a fun and wild experience.
Yeah, no kidding. What was most shocking to you?
Just how, I mean, even the air you breathe has microplastics, so you can't breathe if
Yeah.
you want to avoid plastics. And yeah, I mean, it's obviously terrible for our environment, and so we can do certain things to try to cut down on our plastic, but it shouldn't all be on us. It should be at a more societal level that corporations and
mitigate
the
it,
government, they need to step in.
So now the most recent book, The Year of Living Constitutionally.
Right.
Where did the idea come from? And talk to me about some of the findings.
That one is, I'd always thought it could be a sequel to The Year of Living Biblically, because it's the same premise. Take people who take this very old document and try to follow the original intention or the original meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And so the big question was, how much should we evolve the meaning of the Constitution and how much should we not? And it became much more timely a couple of years ago when the Supreme Court now has a majority of justices who are originalists, meaning they say the most important thing when interpreting the Constitution is, what did the Founding Fathers mean when they wrote it in 1787, or when it was ratified 2 years later? The other side, which is usually the liberal side, but it doesn't quite fit in those neat categories, says, no, we should take into account what it meant, but also look at where we are in society now, because it's 200 years later, it is a very different world. So I thought, let me try to explore what did those founders mean and how much should we evolve by actually following the Constitution, using the tools and mindset of the founders. So that means for the Second Amendment, it meant I walked around New York with a musket, because that's when they wrote the right to bear arms. That was the main arm.
Yeah.
So I bought an 18th century musket and walked around New York. I wrote the book. When they talked about First Amendment, there was no social media. So I wrote pamphlets with a feather pen, and I would hand them out on the street. I quartered a soldier. That was a big thing.
Quartered a soldier.
Yeah, I didn't chop him in four. But the Third Amendment to our Constitution talks about the fact that we don't have to put up soldiers against our will in peacetime, because that was a huge deal then. Now, not as big a deal. But
Right.
I thought it also says, it implies if you do want to quarter a soldier, that is also your right. So I found a friend of a friend who was a soldier, and I put him up for a few days. Very nice guy. Very nice. My wife was like, all right, enough with the quartering. But that was it. And again, there were many takeaways, just like the Bible. It's not a cut and dried issue. I think there's a lot of wisdom from the 18th century. So many, their way of putting on their glasses in many ways was wonderful. In many ways it was terrible because it was a racist, sexist time. But it was also a time when you thought more about the community, the narrowly defined community. But, you know, there's a lot about sacrifice and duty and things like that I think would be nice to get back to.
Yeah.
This idea of it's not all about the individual. You should also be thinking about the community. So there was good and bad in the Constitution, but it was a wonderful, fascinating experience, and I got to talk to luckily I've done enough of these that people mostly answer my calls. So I was able to talk to like the top constitutional experts and get their wisdom.
Were any of your previously held beliefs changed during that experiment?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one was the importance of when I wrote a lot of the book, but I also wrote a lot of letters with a quill pen. Now, I don't think we all need to go back to a quill pen, but what was fascinating is it changed the way my brain worked, because I was offline. I didn't have the dings and distractions and baldness cure advertisements. I was just able to focus on what I was writing, and I do think it makes you a deeper, more subtle thinker. So I do still a lot of writing by hand, and even when I write on my laptop, I use apps like Freedom, where they cut you off from the internet.
Oh, okay.
And that, to me, was just, I kind of knew it, but it really drove that home.
Yeah.
And I think we all need to do a lot more thinking offline. And I don't want to Luddite, I don't want to go back, but think offline and then interact. But don't always be reacting to people, because that way you're reacting just out of anger or these momentary feelings.
Yeah.
So sit back and just...
How do you contextualize some of the more egregious mistakes of the Founding Fathers today? Like, kind of drawing on our previous discussion about, like, what are the things we're getting wrong now that they're going to talk about in 300 years? Like, when it comes to, tearing down statues or vilifying beliefs, writings, whatever, of the Founding Fathers and some of these people, it just doesn't seem like it's a one-size-fits-all thing. And it seems like if we're going to judge the past on the sins of the past when it was culturally acceptable at the time to do those things, then we are also going to open ourselves up to the same judgments when things are changed in a few hundred years.
It's a great point. It's a great point.
I struggle with it. I struggle with it because
it's a hard one.
You got to be able to accept that, like, okay, they definitely got that wrong.
Right.
And that's very wrong and really evil in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that we don't do that anymore. But also, like, they did found a new country that has given a lot of us a lot of opportunity. There's some really, really good things that they did too. We can't just also say that they're just bad, period.
Agree. It's a very complicated issue. One thing to consider is that Thomas Jefferson in particular knew that slavery was a great evil. He wrote about it all the time, and he was aware of his hypocrisy. But he said, I'm too avaricious. I believe that was the word. Avaricious, meaning greedy. I'm too lazy, I'm too greedy to give up this lifestyle. So he deserves condemnation for that. But at the same time, as you say, people are complicated, and he also did some great things. And my favorite founding father is Ben Franklin, who was much more progressive. He at the end of his life especially founded an abolitionist society. So he saw slavery as a great evil and did something about it.
Yeah.
But he had his flaws too. He's a terrible husband. He just cheated on his wife, and he left her for years in America.
Women in Europe and things like that.
When he was gallivanting in Europe, he was a dick to his kids, or at least some of his kids. So he was sexist. And so no one is perfect. And I think... I guess the takeaway is, like you said, let's not lionize the people. Let's glorify some of their ideas and condemn other of their ideas. And let's have humility, like you said, to know that in 200 years, people are going to look at us and be like, you hypocritical asshole.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I take airplane. I know that the environment is a huge disaster. I don't believe it's a hoax like some people on the far right. I think that it is going to have a huge impact on our descendants, and yet I love to go on vacation.
Yeah, right.
So I'm a hypocrite, and I know it. So I try not to be black and white in my judgments and say there are some things they believed and did that were wonderful, some things they believed and did that were absolutely atrocious.
So any projects on the horizon? Is there anything that you're looking at, studying, ideas that you have, publishers wanting to talk to you about a new idea, or are you just kind of focused on chilling out for a second?
I have two things. One is my book Before the Constitution was about puzzles and my love of word puzzles. So I have a daily podcast called The Puzzler with AJ Jacobs on iHeart, and that takes time. It's a daily. It's short. It's like 18 minutes, but I give
Daily though is
daily. It's a grind.
no kidding.
And I love it. I love coming up with these word puzzles, and they're fun. And I give them to sort of celebrity guests, like we had Joseph Gordon-Levitt on recently.
Nice.
And the puzzles are sort of audio puzzles, like Wordle, but in audio form.
Okay.
So I'll give you one
I
quick
do
example.
Wordle basically every day now.
You do?
So, yeah.
Any of the other stuff? Or-
So a buddy of mine turned me on to Wordle probably 3-4 months ago. So I just started doing that, and I was like, this is kind of fun. What other, things are out there? And I noticed that LinkedIn has these like daily kind of puzzles that they do, like four different puzzles. So
Right.
I do those 4 puzzles, and I do the Wordle of the day every day too. Yeah.
Yeah, and the guy, I just was on an event with the guy who does the LinkedIn. He's a 24-year-old current champion of the American Crossword Puzzle Tournament.
Wow.
So
24.
I know. Like, how does he even know things
That's
like,
wild.
Milton Berle from the 50s? Like, how does he know that? But we do sort of an audio version. So we do one where I say a word and it's a clue to a 2-word phrase, and I'm cluing it in the way I say it. So if I said the word like tide, then that's rising tide. Or if I said banana, then that is
Banana split.
it. Wow, you're good. I think you got a puzzle mind. So that's one. And then in terms of books, I had like 3 or 4 ideas, and my agent liked 3 of them, so that was exciting. So I just have to decide. One is an idea that I started and then kind of put on the back burner, which is about misinformation and disinformation. Can I take every part of my life and figure out what is true and what is not? And so that seems kind of timely still.
Yeah, no kidding.
Even though it was 2 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, even with, I think it is going to be pretty wild to watch with AI. These different learning models that are reflecting biases in the programmers and things like that, and it's going to be a pretty wild time, because your information you're getting is, instead of going to Google to find information from 14 different things, you just go to Perplexity or ChatGPT, and it aggregates the data from those 14 different things.
Well, do you think that'll make it more accurate, or not necessarily?
I'd like to think it would make it more accurate if there's a program. The potential is just through the bias of whoever's writing the program is kind of the only thing. So I don't know. I don't know the solution. I'm no tech genius.
No,
so like the open source code, I really don't know.
I am concerned it will not. You could be right that it does make it, I agree with your hope that it should. But on the other hand, what we find interesting and clickable is often the opposite of the truth, because the truth is sort of subtle and complicated. And
it's like the age old, like you're having a bar fight with your buddies about some sort of piece of information. If I'm arguing one point and you're arguing the opposite point, both of us could go to Google and type in a phrase that's a little bit different from the other person and find something to validate the opposing sides of the argument. You know what I mean? So,
well, that's what we just talked about, the motivated reasoning.
Right.
That's an exact example of it. And I actually saw motivated reasoning, or the confirmation bias is another word for it, with my Bible book, and to some extent the Constitution book, because I would get hundreds of letters from atheists saying, thank you for showing how crazy the Bible is. Same number from religious people.
Yeah.
Thank you for renewing my faith in the Bible and showing the good of religion.
Wow.
So it is a human.
You get what you look for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that and like we talked about, I think one of the most important things that we can do is try to get over our confirmation biases.
Yeah. Yeah. AJ, this has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, my pleasure.
Where can people go to learn a little bit more about you, or I mean, the puzzle podcast seems like a great.
It's called The Puzzler. It's on every podcast platform. It's short and fun, I hope. And then just I have a Substack called Experimental Living with AJ Jacobs. It's free. I mean, there's a freemium, but mostly free. And I've got my website, but wherever they want. I do love to hear from people. So even if you have ideas for articles or books, reach out.
Love it. Awesome. If you're watching, listening, go pick up a copy of The Year of Living Constitutionally. Check out some of AJ's previous works as well. You can find them on Substack. You can search whatever podcast app you're listening to this on and find The Puzzler on there and connect with them more over there. Remember, as always, to leave every relationship better than you found it. We'll catch you in the next episode.